Watching English change. This recorded tutorial gives you an overview of the English-speaking world in terms of how English has come about and how and why languages change. We begin by looking at this diagram, which you've seen before, and we look at the areas of phonology, morphology, and syntax. This doesn't really relate to us just now, here. And if you remember this from previous tutorials that you've watched, we look at sounds, combinations of sounds, and such. And we study language in terms of its phonology, its morphology, and its syntax. And this is an overview of that. Phonology looks at sounds, morphology at words, syntax is about sentence structure, and then you have the area of semantics and pragmatics. Now, to talk more specifically about some of the things, this is something we need to consider: language, dialect, and accent. What do they mean? Dialects and accents are used quite interchangeably in certain ways in common usage. For our course, most dialects, they are mutually intelligible with each other, but languages are not. So that means if, for example, Swedish and Norwegians, if you can speak to each other, understand each other, then they're mutually intelligible. In terms of linguistics, then, these are not languages per se. However, in the world of politics, these are languages, but not in terms of linguistics. So many modes of communication which we consider as languages today actually began as dialects of one language or another. And sometimes this cut-off point between what is a language and what is a dialect is rather arbitrary, at least in the world in which we live in. When we talk about accents, accents differ from dialects. Well, how? How do they differ from dialects? Accents are differences at levels of phonology in terms of how the language sounds. So therefore, Norrbottniska or Småländska, these are differences of accent. And in terms of accents, we might talk about Northern English or Southern English. Dialects, they are differences at the levels of phonology too. So dialects include differences in accent, phonology, but also differences in morphology and differences in syntax. So what is a dialect and why do we have them? Dialects, they're spoken by a group of people characterized by certain systematic differences. And why do we have dialects? It's because languages, they are constantly created and recreated, and language is always changing. And it's important to know and to realize that change is not the same as decay. Because a language is changing does not mean it is getting worse, or it just means that it is becoming different. And how are dialects created? Well, these are systematic language changes which occur in the speech of some speakers but not of others. So some speakers begin to speak in a certain way and then others begin to follow suit for some reason. Mutual intelligibility is greatly affected by the amount of social contact between different language groups or different speakers of different varieties of the same language. And mutual intelligibility is also affected by the attitudes of one group towards another. And it's about the lexical, semantic, syntactical relationship between languages. So, language or dialect, when do we say one is one or one is the other? Because the term is not always easy to distinguish. For example, are Swedish, Danish, and Norwegian different languages, or are they different dialects? Now, most Scandinavians would say that they're different languages, and yet they're mutually intelligible, at least in most circumstances. some languages of India and some languages of China, they are not mutually intelligible, and therefore they are more considered to be languages, although we talk about Chinese speakers. 1 billion Chinese speakers, but 1 billion Chinese people don't always understand each other when they speak to each other, because their varieties of Chinese are not mutually intelligible, so therefore it would be more specific to call them languages. Now, to give you an idea of how similar Danish, Norwegian and Swedish are, consider these three. I won't even try to pronounce the Danish and the Norwegian, but you see here there are very great differences, similarities I mean, between the personal the pronouns here. Hon, sitter is almost the same, except there's a slight sound change there. Fönstret, but you see these are similar. Og, ser. These are all the same words. These are pretty much the same. This is the same, and this is almost the same. So they're mutually intelligible. Is it right to call them languages, per se? If we now move on to English, and we look at an overview of English language history. And this is an English language family tree, beginning with this thing here, PIE, and this is known as Proto-Indo-European. Proto means that it's a constructed language. We have no real hard evidence of this. Instead, linguists look at different languages and try to work their way backwards to see how languages have been formed. And the next stage we have is Proto-Germanic and Germanic. In this family tree here, there is the Indo-Iranic tree, the Italic tree, and we also have the, you can't see it here, it's Proto-Germanic, you should say PG. There are other branches, but I've not listed them in this recording. And then we have the Germanic languages, and from the Germanic we have the North Germanic and the West Germanic languages. And the North Germanic we have here, Swedish. We also have Norwegian, Danish, Icelandic and such. And we have then the Old English languages, which arrive then here, from here onwards. And then we call the first period Early Old English, and after that we continue to Middle English and Early Modern English. Now the Indo-European family tree, this is the same diagram but in a different format. We've talked about the Germanic languages here, but the Germanic languages are also related to the Hellenic languages. These are Greek and such. The Italic languages, which went on to be Latin, which are then evolved into Italian, Spanish, French and Romanian. Balto-Slavic, here we have the Russian, Bulgarian, Slovak, Czech, Polish. The Armenian languages, the Aryan languages, and here we have the Indian languages, Hindi, Gujarati and such, and a few others as well. And the Germanic family tree, this is something which I took off a German internet site. You have the Indo-European languages here, and then you have the Germanic languages, the older Germanic ones, and we have the North Germanic and the West Germanic languages. This is East Germanic. This language no longer exists except in one form. This is Gothic, and the only example of Gothic remaining is in Codex Argentinus. This is the Silver Bible, which you find in Uppsala University, which the Swedes stole from in the 1630s from Prague a long time ago. And then you have here the languages Swedish, Norwegian and such, and this is English, and you see English is related to the West Germanic languages, Dutch and Frisian and Afrikaans. And one way in which we look to see about the relationships between the different languages is when we compare these Germanic languages. And you look at cognates, and if you look at English here, which you know, and you know Swedish, and you look at the similarities and the differences. and you see that there are some common sound changes that take place between different vowel sounds and